So now that we have everyone back together, hello and welcome to this episode of Event Insights. I'm Chrissy with Safe Events Global, and joining me today I have Dr. Nicola Cade and Dr. Chris Kerry. And today they're going to be talking to us about social open innovation, and as the title suggests, with a specific look at the favela communities in Rio. If you have any questions during the presentation, feel free to pop them in the chat box on the right-hand side there, and we can have a chat through them afterwards. And in the meantime, Nicola and Chris, I'll hand it over to you guys.
Thank you. Okay. Good morning, everyone. As Chrissy mentioned, my name's Dr. Chris Kerry. I'm currently the Deputy Head of School in Marketing, Events and Tourism at Anglia Ruskin University. And I'm joined today by my brilliant colleague, Dr. Nicola Cade, a lecturer from the Edge Hotel School at the University of Essex. Just a bit of background, a bit of context. This presentation, this piece of research that we've carried out is a result of many conversations that Nicola and I have had, dare I say, often over coffee and skiving from what we should have really been doing, talking about often us talking about the sort of transformational promises of mega events and how these promises play out in the real world. And I think we found ourselves often talking about how innovation happens not just in boardrooms or tech rooms, but often in the places that we overlook, like the favelas of Rio, which we're going to talk about today. What we hope to do today is to talk a little bit about the role of trust and safety and how they are not just desirable conditions, but essential foundations for social open innovation to take root. And I'll explain that term later on. Especially in communities that are marginalised and have historically been so. So in the next hour, we're going to take you through the case study of Morro de Prazeres and share the opportunities and the traumas that emerged after the Rio 2016 Olympics. So just want to kind of set the stage a little bit, as Rio 2016 was quite a while ago. But the messaging around the bid was bold. It was really ambitious, and it promised transformation. The Brazilian government positioned themselves as a vibrant emerging economy ready to take its place on the global stage. And the games themselves were framed not only as a sporting spectacle, but as a tool for national development, urban regeneration, and also repositioning the country on an international stage. And then in many ways, that narrative made a lot of sense. If you've ever been to Brazil, it's a country with immense natural beauty, lots of cultural heritage, and is part of the sort of growing economic BRIC group, especially during the early 2010s when the bid was secured. But beneath that global facing image, there are deep structural inequalities, particularly in urban centres like Rio. And the favelas themselves, those impoverished neighbourhoods in Brazil, are often stigmatized urban communities that do symbolise the kind of challenges that the country encounters. So, this brings us to the kind of central dilemma, if you like, of the today's presentation, which is, can kind of short-term interventions like mega events, like the Olympics, be used as a springboard for longer-term social innovation, or does the kind of temporary safety risk becoming a facade, one that kind of masks the ongoing exclusion that exists within these spaces? So to explore this, we did turn to social open innovation, or SOI as we would often refer to it, and that sort of topic, that concept asks, how do communities create and collaborate in these settings? So I'm going to pass on to Nicola, who is now going to talk a little bit more about sort of the strategies that the government employed.
Thanks, Chris. Yes, hello. So hello, everyone. As Chris said, I'm Nikki. So Chris has given quite a detailed introduction of the setup of the Brazil's mega events. And just to provide a little bit more background into that. So obviously mega event strategies are used for various reasons. as Chris has mentioned, but mostly for economic benefits, which can include visitation from both domestic and international tourists, to help try and improve or generate this positive destination image to attract those types of visitation. However, I don't know how many of you know much about Brazil, but essentially Brazil and particularly Rio have implications and challenges with criminal groups that exist among the communities of the favela communities in the city, as well as part of the larger area of South America, really. So, as Chris mentioned, one of the kind of key reasons for bidding to host for these mega events, which includes the FIFA World Cup in 2014 and the Rio 2016 Olympic and Paralympic Games, was to improve the impoverished and declining areas through urban regeneration, which is often too expensive for governments and councils to do without this huge sponsorship that they would receive from the International Olympic Committee. So these are opportunities for these types of cities to implement such huge structural and transformational changes. So this was one of the key reasons to host both those mega events, and it was also part of the kind of what I term the 10-year reign of mega events, which includes the Pan American Games in 2008 as well. So just moving on, obviously I've kind of touched on this, that the urban regeneration is kind of the key area. So the investments in tourism, there obviously with that there was a lot of issues around the violent and forced evictions of favela communities, because obviously when we have a mega event, it's not just an event that comes and goes, it's not as transient as other events can be. They come and they create these major transformations to the city, so the infrastructures are changed, the landscape's changed entirely, and to do that you need these spaces. And obviously a city like Rio that's majorly built up, concrete sort of city if you like, there's not a lot of spaces for you to do that within those areas that tourists could move around in. So this became problematic through these kind of forced evictions of the impoverished communities like the favelas, and it obviously also resulted in displacement. So the people who were losing their houses or their property or their businesses were being then forced out to more peripheral areas of Rio, which were kind of around the north zone areas and west zone areas of the actual kind of state of Rio, if you like, which worsened the kind of social conditions for these communities that they already have anyway. It kind of minimised or limited their access to their employment and education. So essentially it's further marginalising the marginalised. However, for some existing favelas, obviously we have this issue of the control by criminal groups in some, not all favelas. I think there's over 200 favelas in Rio alone. So they're huge communities as well. So for the purpose of the mega events, the government introduced this police pacification program known as the UPP, which was supposed to have been a program or a social program which was meant to kind of bring positive benefits for these types of communities. Again, this caused implications for not necessarily the ones it was implemented in, but other communities that were more peripheral that didn't have criminal group activity, because the criminal groups were forced out by the police pacification, and they ended up in communities that didn't have any control by criminal groups. But it also forced some criminal groups underground, which meant they were operating within the community. They didn't actually leave the community while the UPP were controlling the community as such. So there's this kind of issue of the UPP being implemented for the purposes to improve safety and everything else. But on the flip side of that, it caused other disruptions for the wider area of Rio, and not just the favelas in which they were implemented, because obviously you can imagine the cultural dynamics of a police pacification program with a criminal group and the general population within that community already all trying to live alongside each other is a recipe for disaster in certain cases. However, it's not all negative. There were positive outcomes from the UPP, and it obviously allowed some communities to generate socio-cultural projects, which generated socio-economic income for them as well, because it provided this safe environment, this safe space for them to welcome visitors and be able to sort of share their culture and their beliefs. So the UPP programme, just to give you a little bit of background, was introduced in 2008 into 38 favelas across the Olympic corridor. Now, I assume you'd know, but the Olympic corridor is kind of the areas in which people would be, gathering to enjoy the Olympics. So obviously the key thinking was, well, we need to keep those areas safe from criminal activity and unpredictable, gunfights and whatever else thought they might occur. So it was implemented into 38, and the main objectives was to consolidate the state control over armed crime, to return local people to peace, and to apply timely, effective and plural instruments with emphasis on mediation and resolve any kind of related conflict. So they were kind of the key areas to the UPP programme. There's a lot of arguments that the UPP didn't do what it said it was going to do, and it was all sort of a rhetorical farce of a mask of what actually they were trying to do. So there's a lot of arguments around that, but it's too long to go into for the purposes of today. So favelas, obviously, as I've already mentioned and Chris has mentioned, they can be dangerous communities. So this is just a little bit of background. They're marked by systemic exclusion, with limited access to education and employment, despite having or displaying or owning, if you like, rich culture, creativity, diversity and vibrancy. So the communities are very different. As I said, there's hundreds of them, and they all have different things going on. They all live differently. Some are better off than others. So they're all very unique. There's no one size fits all for a favela. But they are very much embedded in Rio's landscape. So if you look at the landscape, you can see the contrast of the favela alongside like the tourist hotel, if you like, along the Copacabana beach area. And it's quite fascinating because they are built into the landscape. So it's not something you can really easily eradicate, if you like, which is what they've had a lot of issue over the years of been trying to be dissolved, if you like. So they're often for this reason, because they are built from scratch. They were built, well over 100 years ago, and essentially they've just got bigger and bigger and bigger, and so they're quite often referred to as slums, which is quite problematic and a questionable way to define them, given their uniqueness, their resilience and their self-sustained strengths that they have. And since sort of the 1980s, they've had this issue with drugs and the criminal group activities. So since sort of the 80s, we've had this war on drugs, which is a policing concept for the wider area of Central America, which is fed down to South America. And it's obviously with these kind of criminal groups being positioned within certain favela communities, it makes these communities very precarious and unpredictable landscapes, which makes it very, very dangerous for tourists, just general tourists, to go and visit these types of communities. So obviously the Foreign Commonwealth Office do advise no tourists to not enter any form of favela at all, even if it's through sort of organised tours or activities. So the main reason behind sort of the favela concept, or the favelas as communities, is for me purposely, was I selected these because this has come from my PhD research, and essentially they were, from what I could gather, the most affected population through Brazil's mega events, and it's an area in event research which is lacking through its sort of in-depth empirical investigation, where you actually speak to the people that were affected, you gain and gather their experiences. It's quite often economic studies or social sort of studies around these kind of issues from events is often just quantified rather than kind of noted of what actually happened, people actually telling you from the ground what happened during those times. So the host populations, as many of us would know, is that in events they're the most affected, and they're often forgotten, and they're often the losers when these events are hosted. There's not always this legacy issue of them actually receiving anything at the other end of that, there is not always a given, and they're the ones that have to live with the changes and the outcomes of these particular events in the long term. However, given all these implications, as I said, the UPP has this kind of negative persona about it. There's a lot of arguments about it being really, really bad thing, but there are some positive opportunities that arose from the UPP, and some of these kind of opened opportunities for what we term social open innovation. So I'm going to pass back to Chris because that's his kind of area.
Yeah, so just to sort of summarise, obviously, once the Brazilian government had been given the rights to host the Rio Olympics, they put in place this police protection force in the Olympic corridor to try and sort of provide an element of safety to where the Olympics were likely to be operating, and that, in short, started to have an impact on that local environment, and we started to see things occurring, innovation occurring. And essentially what we were looking when discussing this, myself and Nicola, we were looking for kind of a sort of theory or an underlying kind of concept that really started to explain what we were seeing. And we sort of regularly found ourselves talking about this concept of social open innovation as a sort of a explanatory concept. And so what do I mean by social open innovation? Well, it's essentially a fusion of two very important ideas, one being social innovation. Social innovation is where we see the development of new solutions that address social challenges. So these are usually kind of unmet or inadequately met by states or markets. So think of things like grassroots responses to education gaps, housing needs, community safety. Social innovation is often those types of things that are driven by people closest to the problem. So those that kind of live with the lived experience and the community contexts that it operates within. So we sort of thought that was quite a relevant topic, a relevant concept that sort of explained some of the things that we saw here. And then the other thing, and sort of drawing on my own research, was this kind of concept of open innovation. And this is a concept that's emerged from the business world, and it's one that challenges the idea that organizations rely on internal knowledge. Instead, sort of promotes that the exchange of ideas across company boundaries brings in external expertise, insights, often leads to collaborations that accelerate problem solving. So if we bring these two together, we get what we call social open innovation, which is a model that allows knowledge and creativity to flow in and out of marginalized communities, like the favelas. And sort of what we found was when this is enabled, residents start to co-create solutions by blending their knowledge with external networks. So things like NGOs, researchers, artists, even sort of digital technologies and digital platforms. So we really, without wanting to give our findings away too much, we started to see these things emerging. And essentially, we saw it sort of emerge in an atypical way, where ideas were sort of flowing in the early stages of innovation. So in the idea generation phase. And that's what you can see here on the left-hand side of what we call the open innovation funnel. So this is a sort of diagram that sort of explains what I've just described, in terms of, on the left-hand side, we've got where businesses, community groups, NGOs are all coming up with ideas, those circles being that knowledge and that expertise that can flow into a community and out with the community. And then as ideas move through the funnel, they're refined, some fall away, others gain sort of momentum through sort of iteration, testing, collaboration. And they're often developed, those ideas and that knowledge is often developed into more structured, viable innovations that ultimately reach the market or the communities themselves. And so why is this kind of relevant for us today? Well, in contexts like favelas, the sort of traditional innovation funnel, if you like, this idea of kind of top-down expert-led innovation just doesn't fit neatly with what we observed. Because favelas, that they're environments that are rich in kind of lived knowledge, the people full of resilience and cultural practices that are very localized, and they face structural barriers that make innovation far more complex than a traditional business setting. So what open innovation offers for these communities is the potential for kind of two-way knowledge flows. So local communities can develop, contribute their really deep contextual understanding to very unique situations. And the external partners, so the NGOs and event organisers like the Rio Olympic Committee and other bodies involved in delivering the Olympics, can bring their knowledge and expertise to those favelas. And in doing so, that combined expertise and knowledge can lead to quite innovative solutions to those problems that those communities encounter. And actually, what's really interesting is, and what we're trying to present today, is that we actually observe this happening within the prazeres, and especially during periods of calm and visibility. So during the Rio Olympics, for example, where there was this calm linked to the police presence, there was a noticeable increase in this type of collaboration, these grassroots initiatives and external engagement linked to this social open innovation. But as we will highlight later, this process is often quite fragile, and there were a lot of conditions that are needed for that to occur. So I'm going to pass on to Nikki, who's going to just explain a little bit more about our case study.
Yeah, so thanks, Chris. So as Chris mentioned, prazeres, essentially that translates as hill of pleasures. And you can see from the slide here, the red outline, there's 2 parts to it, or 3 parts to it, and there's over, just a bit of context to put it into size, you can see there's a football pitch there, which is actually their football pitch, full size as well. There's over 10,000 people that live in just this one favela, and this was my case study for my PhD, and as Chris says, the case study for the purposes of the research we're working on at the moment. And it's located in the Santa Teresa neighbourhood of Rio, which is a strong historical Bohemian cultural. I want to say town, but I'd say it's an area. It wouldn't really be a town. So it's quite far up into the sort of the hill area, and particularly with prazeres, it is located in an amazing position. It's the outlook of it is stunning. You can see Christ the Redeemer, you can see Sugarloaf Mountain, so you can see across sort of the sea, and kind of the area of Rio below it. It is an incredible area to visit. So that's where prazeres is located, and the UPP were implemented in prazeres in 2011, and during this sort of time, this is when it sort of opened up opportunities, as Chris has mentioned, with the projects. But just to give you a little bit of insight, because obviously you're probably wondering that the FCO tell you not to enter these communities, and they're obviously dangerous communities. So to access these communities is problematic. So I obviously had to think of a methodology, of a way to access these communities, or this community in particular, that would support accessing high-risk research settings, which again is another area in our sort of area of research through methodologies that lacks sort of effective processes or best practices for entering high-risk research settings. So I had a hard time trying to find the best way to approach people, essentially, obviously from being in the white British female in the UK to go into one of the favelas in the middle of Rio in Brazil was kind of like, how the hell am I going to get there? So what happened, it was quite lucky, I suppose. People say it wasn't, it was due to me keeping, the ambition to do it, but I feel it was luck. I contacted an NGO founder, and she said to me, there's this community that put together these tourism projects, the community projects from off the back of Rio 2016, essentially. And she said, you should talk to them. And she gave me this guy's number, and he happened to be a photographer. And he said, oh no, you need to talk to Charles. So I got given Charles's number, and they were like, what, through WhatsApp? And I was like, this is weird. I just want to email someone, because I felt it was more professional as a researcher. That's the way I should be contacting them. But they don't really do that. They wanted to talk to me through WhatsApp. So I thought, okay, we'll do this. So I started to talk to Charles about what I wanted to do, what kind of questions I wanted to ask about the Olympics and other mega events in Brazil. And he said, oh, that sounds really good. It's fantastic, because, you're trying to get the voices of us rather than listening to, other sort of secondhand stories that don't tell the truth, and, how we've been impacted, and we've got the UPP, and, so it was all kind of sort of snowballing from this conversation. And what happened was, I was in constant contact with Charles for 6 months before I actually went into Rio and went to Brazeres. And this obviously allowed me to build that trust with Charles, but also the community. So the participants for my research knew me before I even knew them. I hadn't even met them. And they knew who I was, and they welcomed me with like open arms. Literally, it's like I'd been a long lost family member returning. It was quite fascinating and humbling, if I'm honest. And so I built this relationship for 6 months, and which was done through what myself and my 2 supervisors at the time termed the digital model. And this was actually written into a research paper for tourism geographies on creative methodology. So what it was, it suggests that you locate your key gatekeepers for access into a community or case study or whatever it might be through using digital forms such as WhatsApp or emails or whatever it might be, and you sustain that contact for a period of time to develop that reciprocal trust, and then you would enter the fieldwork location for you to then obviously conduct your research. So this was a way that enabled me to show them that I was, not necessarily a friend, because obviously I wanted something out of them, but they were more than happy to help me with my research, because they felt that their voices were being listened to, and I could project those voices on their behalf, which was very, very important to them, because they were obviously very marginalised in their voices anyhow. So this was the way I accessed the community. So obviously ethics was another issue, but I'm not going to go into that. But essentially, this assisted me in trying to get into a high risk, precarious landscape. So from that, once I was in, obviously I conducted numerous interviews, observations, research journal, all kinds of different things through different methodology approaches, which was kind of termed methodological bricolage, which is where you literally put together various methodology tools to enable you to get to what it is you're trying to get to in your research. So it was very much lots of things were being fed into me to get all this data that I had, and I had loads of it. So once I'd obviously analysed and arranged everything, I had these kind of 2 key themes. And the first one was this serendipitous empowerment. So basically this embraces the positive aspects of the UPP implementation. And it was identified in the data that there was many grassroots and tourism projects that were only possible through the UPP presence. Because of the safety that the UPP brought to the community, it enabled them to allow or receive external visitation and tourism. So this kind of shows sort of how they were breaking those barriers of exclusion, and obviously being able to be open and share their culture. So it provided this ripe ground, if you like, for innovation to occur. The second thing was collective vulnerability, and this is based on the collective vulnerability of the criminal group generated trauma and the public authority generated trauma, which is obviously the UPP in this situation. And it was basically the disruption when, obviously, just before Rio 2016, Brazil went bankrupt. There was a lot of issues around political corruption, and everything went wrong. And essentially that destroyed a lot of the tourism and grassroots projects for Brazeres, which was really sad, because they were doing so well and it was building, quite positively for the community. And obviously during that time, the criminal groups saw the opportunity to return to their original communities, but also interestingly, which I didn't know until I did my research, was the criminal group in Preserves did not actually leave the community, which is why I said earlier that they sort of went underground. And that's exactly what the criminal group did here. They operated beneath the kind of UPP presence. And I believe the UPP probably knew, but as long as they weren't sort of crossing paths, it was okay. But obviously with this, the police weren't being paid, so there was corruption with the police and all kinds of things were starting to occur. And then with that, obviously all this conflict and violence returned. And obviously the community had to make that hard decision to stop all tourism to the community in fear of crossfire or gunfights that could just break out at any point. Which this sadly meant that they lost a lot of their projects. But there were still some that continued, luckily, and one happened to be the recycling project, which was a result of a horrific landslide that happened in Preserves in 2011, I believe, from memory. And this is basically an example of social open innovation, which Chris will explain a little bit more in the findings, and how this has been shared with the wider favela network, which is a group of favelas that come together and they share ideas. And essentially this is a kind of group of like-minded favela communities who want to sustain the community for future generations. So they want the favelas to keep going. Obviously they're embedded in history through the generations. So they're very important to the communities who currently live in them now, or the people that live in the communities now. So this project now, the Recycle project in particular, is operating in other favelas across Rio, alongside other sort of environmental awareness projects that have been created as well. So this was where kind of the themes were coming from, and obviously during my themes I identified a lot of innovation, like all these projects that were developed from grassroots. So essentially the findings, to link my findings to the social open innovation that Chris explores, is where Chris can come back now. Thank you.
Yeah. So yeah, as Nicola mentioned, what we found, what was really key was the temporary safety that the UPP presence created. It created a window of opportunity for these communities to start working together. Now, whether that was in some cases that was the gangs and the violence migrating to other areas, or whether that was suppression. Regardless of the way that it occurred, what it did do is just create conditions for people to experiment, for people not just individually but collectively to start working together. As Nicola mentioned, we found like artists and cultural leaders launching workshops, residents were opening their homes to visitors, young people were engaging with digital tools and training. And as you know, that sort of manifested itself in examples like digital literacy classes. So there was residents learning basic tech skills. There were dance schools, cultural collectives being sprung up in these regions, and a lot of education workshops as well. And whilst these weren't kind of massive institutional programs, they were grassroots initiatives, micro enterprises, social ventures, community projects, which very much meets that kind of social innovation mantra that I talked about earlier. And if we think back to kind of that open innovation funnel image that I mentioned right back at the start of the presentation, what we saw in essence was that this kind of funnel just became a little bit more open, a little bit more lucid, a little bit more permeable. It opened the funnel. Ideas were being shared with NGOs, from universities, from people abroad, with the community itself, and vice versa. And some of those ideas were permeating back as well. And that's because ultimately what we found was, risk felt manageable for people. People could, under these kind of in this environment, people could try things without fear of immediate retaliation, without fear of criminal interference, without the fear of police violence. And that's really what we found is that's really critical, because innovation does always carry some level of uncertainty, some level of vulnerability. And without that basic trust and safety, the funnel just simply closes. So what this demonstrated, and what our case study hopefully demonstrates, is what's possible with it when you give communities through mega events that moment of stability. It allows trust to germinate, and that fragile calm allows social open innovation to emerge within these communities. And we think that's a really positive thing to share with you today. And Nicola's kindly put together some pictures of when she was there, of these types of things actually in action, if you like, in reality.
But yeah, I'll just give. Oh, sorry, Chris. Carry on.
Yeah, no, go. Perhaps explain some of the images, Nicola. Yeah,
I was
really
just going
helpful.
to just quickly, just to make it a little bit more obvious. So the Recycle project, which you can see, Recycle Cow, can't speak Portuguese to save my life, and I did have a translator. You can see there with the T-shirt, they gave me gifts and all kinds of different things. But in the bottom right corner, you can see the actual project taking place there. So they'd get everybody to get all of their recycling, plastic, whatever, cardboard together. And then they would go around the entire favela and collect it and then sort it, and they'd use it to create, I don't know, souvenirs or ornaments, or they would then have it taken away. So, there was lots of that, and it just shows this process. The graffiti picture, Camino de Graffiti, which is cut off a little bit, the blue picture at the bottom, is the project which came off of the tourism favela tour, or Prazeres tour, which is in the top right corner there. If you can see the T-shirt, Just tour in the image there with tourists, and that was part of that the tour. So just spit it out of the graffiti tour. So the graffiti pathway essentially, and they would be taken around this route, and they would be able to engage with the local community through buying souvenirs from they call them the old women who used to knit and crochet, and then they had bars and restaurants in the favela, and the tourists could go there and buy food and drink. So there was obviously this big operation which included most of the community, and that's actually Charles in the top right corner wearing the T-shirt, who was my gatekeeper. So this gives you an idea, as Chris said, of just some of the examples. Sorry, Chris, I'll pass back.
No, but it's really helpful, I think, to sort of illustrate what is possible when you put in place those conditions for innovation to occur. But I think what's perhaps most sobering is kind of what happened after the Olympics, and I think this is the key kind of message we want to try to get across today. Is, as we mentioned during the games, there was something really positive taking root. There was a sense of community spirit developing, and trust was growing. But unfortunately, it was really short-lived. After the Olympics ended, the UPP presence, the police presence began to retreat. And obviously with that, the safety that had enabled that community-led innovation quickly eroded. Criminal groups kind of came from sort of reasserted control, whether that be re-entering the area or by sort of re-emerging from the slumbers, if you like. And obviously the violence returned with it. And obviously for the communities themselves, the impact was quite devastating, because not just because of the fact that these projects are dismantled or, sort of cease to continue, but also because of, I guess, in essence, there was a form of sort of socio-cultural trauma there, because they'd seen that window of what was possible, and therefore having that taken away, it actually even deepened the sense of exclusion that these communities feel. And, there's an economic consequence there too, in terms of, we mentioned how tourism, was sort of occurring within these spaces, and that is influenced and impacted, and often, young people therefore kind of want to move out of these areas rather than stay there, which has a long-term economic impact as well. So that kind of brings us really to the broader reflection of today, which is, the lost potential legacy of major events in developing areas if there isn't a long-term strategic plan around policing and safety. Particularly in events like the Olympics, which often talk about legacy and in terms of infrastructure and economic uplift. I think what our case really shows is that unless the trust and safety is sustained, these legacies are just essentially greenwashing. They're not actually true legacies, and ultimately the benefits of these events just collapse quite quickly. And Nicola's just got a sort of image on the next slide, which sort of shows this in really stark imagery, which is, one of the sort of community buildings which had been developed during this period of calm was just, a great example of it just physically being destroyed, and
Yeah.
as a result of kind of criminal group conflict within the region.
Yeah. So this is a protected building that's been there for history. Well, I can't remember how long, but a long number of years. And it is, like Chris said, it was developed for the community to use for their projects. And there was investment from the city council to have books, library, computers, and all kinds of different things in there, and dance schools. Education projects and all kinds of things were happening, and this was one building that was protected, that was said the criminal group would not touch. They would never aim towards that particular building. If there was conflict, they'd ensure they'd move away from there. Obviously I don't know how possible that is during shooting and things like that, but essentially this building had never been touched until this was around 2020, 2021, I think, from memory. And essentially conflict broke out between the police and the criminal group, and a criminal group leader who had just been released from prison. So it's the Red Command group. There's four now, different criminal groups in Rio in Brazil. And the Red Commands are the ones that control Prazeres. But there's two leaders, so that even if they're in the same command, they still are against each other, obviously for money purposes and competition. And essentially he was released from prison, came out really angry for whatever purpose, and started a war in Prazeres with the other leader of the criminal group. And obviously UPP are still in Prazeres to this day. They've never left, but it kicked off, and obviously you can see the images that's destroyed the building through the bullets that have gone through windows and the walls, which is really sad because this was a really, really important building for the community. Yes, Chris, sorry, carry on.
Yeah, no. So, I think hopefully what I want to do now is just reflect a little bit about of what the case of Prazeres teaches us, not just about kind of Rio, but about the wider sort of roles that communities and event organisers can play in emerging and developing contexts. So I think what Prazeres revealed is something really powerful, that social open innovation is possible in marginalised communities as a result of these events and events being staged in these communities, and even in environments that are really shaped by poverty and exclusion, such as the favelas themselves. The brief windows of calm that these events allow does give them opportunity to take risks, to build connections, and to solve community problems. But I think what the crucial message for those of you listening today is that people that are involved in events and tourism around the globe is that if you want your events to deliver on that transformational promise and legacy that's often touted when proposing these things, then it's not just about what happens within whilst the event is operating, but also about what's left behind. And too often, the strategies that are proposed are often very short term and surface level, and they're deployed to manage, in some cases, perception, not really to build long lasting impact. So what we really are urging those of you that are involved in these projects to do moving forward is to really think about building long term investment strategies into community safety and resilience when staging events in these areas, not just in policing, but obviously in things like safe public spaces, youth support, preventative infrastructure. Because what we found, and hopefully what we've demonstrated today, is in doing so, what you're really doing is supporting grassroots innovation. You're giving space to local people, local entrepreneurs, local artists, local organisers to develop those solutions to their issues, the problems, the contexts that are relevant to them. And I think really honestly, without doing so, the promises of, the promise of legacy really risks becoming empty, and is just something that ultimately is, like I said earlier, just something that is for a marketing soundbite rather than an actual true reflection of what's happening. Um, so yeah, in short, if events are going to be genuine drivers of transformation, then we all must do more to develop a sort of long-term strategy to developing systems of trust and safety. And with that, we'll leave it there. Thank you for listening, and any questions?
Thank you very much. That was really, really interesting. I had a couple of our attendees message me privately, say they found it really interesting. They had to jump off. We do have one question here from Rafaela. Rafaela is asking, if arranging an event in a place like this, do you think it's possible without direct communication with local police? I know you kind of touched on that already, but I'll let you answer there anyway.
I'm not quite sure I fully understand the question personally. I don't know. Do you, Chris? I think if arranging an event in a place like this, do you think it's possible without direct communication with local police?
I think what they're asking
in favelas, maybe, is that?
Yeah, or in more of these kind of similar communities.
Yeah. Okay, that makes that's a bit like when they played in Rio.
Yeah, I think what we saw was, obviously, in the case that we explored, the safety was created by police intervention.
Yeah.
So I think, that is part of generally a wider event strategical planning process, is to, if we look at even in maybe communities within the UK, for example, where there are events in probably sort of marginalised communities within here, you typically would organise those events with police support. And I think ultimately what we're saying is that is a crucial component of that, and it needs to be considered. I think what we're also saying is, it's not just that. There's things like other preventative infrastructure, so things like safe public spaces, youth support programs, cultural programs as well, to try and change perspectives and views of these things that can go alongside it. But I definitely think it's a crucial part, a crucial element of it, and something that needs to be thought of when planning events in these areas.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, and I think, thanks for the question, Rafaela, as well. It's a good question. It's also, I mean, I don't know if you know much about Brazil, but the police relationship with criminal groups and general the black population, if you like, there's a big issue with inequality and racial abuse, and all kinds of things are going on all the time, daily. That's just a continued historical stigma that's just stayed there. And essentially, despite the police being a positive for innovation in this context, the police aren't a positive to a lot of the community, and they're very much rejected and everything else. So it's kind of hard to suggest that the police were the be all and fix all for this area, because they're not well received at all. And it took them quite a while, once they were implemented in Preserves, to build that trust with the actual, just the normal, I say normal, it sounds really awful, the actual general population that aren't part of the criminal group. And it's difficult to say that police bring this, safety, because not always they can bring really kind of dangerous elements to it as well. So it is a good question, but it's also very hard to say that yes and no. But like Chris says, it's not just about policing; it's about creating these public spaces of safety, and bringing youth into support for those as well. So
I think what we saw here, what we're really talking about here, is cultural change, and unfortunately, what we saw here was the police presence was just too short-lived. So that created space for cultural for interaction and for innovation to occur, but because it was only a relatively short a temporal factor, ultimately, once it was removed, culture had not changed significantly enough for those things to have been eradicated, so the old behaviours just re-emerge. I think what perhaps saying is that I think it is possible, but there needs to be, particularly in places like this where there is an ingrained violent culture, you need a longer period of time, of that in place for that culture to change. And that would vary from region and area to area, which so possible, but obviously in some of more the extreme environments, I think improbable. Is probably the best way to describe it.
If you're running an event, no matter where it is, if it's a public event, you would have to have the police involved in the planning stages at least, and then maybe, have, depending on the size of the event, have some police on board at the event as well, as well as local authorities. So I can only imagine in every country it will be similar enough, and depending on the communities where the event is running, you might have to have additional people who know the ins and outs of that community involved.
Of course, yeah. And I think that's what we're really trying to promote today is that it genuinely needs to be a considered element of your event strategy, is that longer term kind of support for particularly around mega events like the Olympics being an extreme example, but when running a mega event, it needs to be a part of a long term kind of post event planning process, because it, as you can see, without it, it's very ineffective.
Yeah. I mean, it could be something written into the safety advisory groups that they have at events that, we need this extra element of safety, which can come from maybe professional securities or whatever it might be. But again, the context of Rio is very, very unique. And the favela communities are, in their own. So it's very difficult to have this kind of comparable, would it work in this community without police? Yeah, probably. It probably would. But like Chris said, if we was to do it in these types of communities or extreme communities, then it is an unlikely thing to happen. It wouldn't be able to happen. Yeah,
of course. Well, thank you for the question. I don't see any more coming in, so I suppose we'll probably leave it there. But guys, thank you so much for your time. It was really, really interesting.
You're welcome.
Fascinating look into something that we might not usually get to see into.
No. Thank you. Thank you for having us.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Have a great day.
Thank you.
Bye.